Good evening. It's nice to see the crowd gradually growing back to size. And how many people we got watching online, Todd? 13. All right. Doing good. I usually average like 5 pre-pandemic, so I'm happy with 13. Turn to John 9, 1 through 3. John 9, 1 through 3. We start a new chapter in John tonight. So while you're turning to John 9, 1 through 3, tonight's message is entitled, The Blame Game. So as I mentioned before, my first full-time job with benefits right outside of PCC was working for Central Carolina Bank. For those of you old enough to remember Central Carolina Bank. So I worked for CCB at their help desk doing tech support. I've talked about this lots of times. I spent most of my day telling people to restart their computers, or I reset their passwords for them, or I plugged something in. That was a lot of what I did. And so after doing this for a little while, one day my supervisor comes up to me and he's like, "Glenn, you're doing a great job. I want you to attend this meeting in my place tomorrow morning." And I was high on the hog. Here I was, 22, 23, and I'm going to a meeting that only the managers go to. Thought I was fancy, right? And it was the meeting we went to every morning here, because I worked in this building where all the IT for all the states that the bank supported all ran into this one building. So there was lots of stuff. There was network, there was servers, there was software, there was hardware and people that handled the money transactions and all that. And so we were all there, and it was called the morning turnover meeting. So all the department managers showed up, and they discussed what broke the day before and how we could resolve those issues going forward. And so, of course, being a bank, everyone was calm and professional and really worked well together going forward. Deborah's laughing because she's done tech support in the past. That's not even remotely true to what actually went on in that meeting. Everyone blamed each other constantly. Some of those people were so good at throwing each other under the bus, I felt they should have walked out of the meeting with a stuffed animal or something, And it didn't take long for me to very quickly figure out why my supervisor sent me in his place. He said, "You're doing a great job in those meetings, Glenn. You can keep going." And I'm like, I must have made him mad at something. But no one actually cared about fixing the problem. They just cared about not being blamed. 9 times out of 10, it ended up being the fault of the person who didn't attend the meeting that particular day. It's the way it goes. But the blame game is not a new thing. We can go all the way back to Genesis 3, when sin first entered the world. Blame entered the world also. So tonight we see Jesus and the disciples play the blame game as well. But Jesus gives an unexpected answer. That's where we are, John 9, 1 through 3. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him." So we've been through the first 8 chapters of John. And the first 8 chapters of John, as best us theologians, pastors can tell, this has probably covered somewhere around 2.5 years of Jesus' life and active ministry. One of the many things that we actually don't consider when we study the life and times of Jesus Christ is just the lasting impact Jesus had. Now, as Pastor Dave so eloquently preached Sunday, all of Christianity hinges on the resurrection. As every single revival message that went on this past week, and if you didn't listen, it was fantastic. Please go back on YouTube and watch or even rewatch. It all comes down to and hinging upon the person of Jesus Christ and whether or not he resurrected. But when we look at all the different proofs of his deity, of who he was, of him being who he said he was, we also have to look at the impact that he had. If I took a survey and asked you to rattle off who were the last 10 Super Bowl teams that won that didn't involve Tom Brady, you're not probably going to be able to get them without Google, right? If I ask you, who was the great bear of Wall Street in 1923 or something, a lot of this stuff, it's been lost to time. People that were great during their time kind of gets lost. I can't even name a president prior to Reagan for the most part, because they weren't president during my lifetime without Google. We think about people that had these high office and had all this influence, and they're quickly forgotten, usually within a generation or two. But Jesus, we're still talking about him today. And when you consider the level of lasting impact Jesus had in a relatively short amount of time, 3 years. He was an average-looking man from a small town, from a small country. Even to this day, Israel's population is about 9 million people, and it occupies about 8,500 square miles. The closest comparison to a United State is New Jersey, the 5th smallest state and one of the worst states. That's neither here nor there. It's my own personal problem. Here, a man with no formal education taught in such a manner, we're still devoting twice a week to studying to it 2,000 years later. And part of that lasting impact, part of that validation of him being who he said he was the miracles he worked when he showed upon the scene. Miracles of healing were not common in the Old Testament. A lot of you thought, that can't be right. Please go back and look and try to prove me wrong, because that always amuses me. And you'll learn something. There were lots of miracles in the Old Testament. Absolutely not that many that involved healing. You had Naaman being cured of leprosy. You had Hezekiah being cured of a terminal disease. You have people being cured of being bit by a mass amount of poisonous snakes during the time of Moses. But beyond that, you don't see a whole lot. But Jesus shows up. People are getting healed left and right. This particular healing here that we're going to study in John 9, I'm going to be honest with you, for quite some time, in John 9 has enough impact that an entire chapter of John's gospel is devoted to it. The first 2 to 2.5 years of ministry get 8 chapters. And this one miracle gets an entire chapter. Some miracles in some of the other gospels sometimes don't get much more than a paragraph or a sentence where it says Jesus healed all the sicknesses and cast out all the unclean demons and stuff like that. But here we've got an entire chapter devoted to this one healing of this one person. So let's see why. So Jesus passes by and he sees a man who was blind from birth. So again, it's like to mention, we don't know the time gap between 8 and 9. This could have been the very moment he got kicked out, or more accurately, he snuck out of the temple there in John 8 because they were planning to kill him and he came by. I tend to think it's been a gap of time. The reason I think that is because this is the same place people had just threatened to stone him to death. And the response of the disciples is not, Jesus, let's get out of here before they kill us, because we know they have a tendency to run away when things get tough, as we're going to see later on in all the Gospels. But either way, Jesus is leaving or is around the area of the temple, and they see a guy who has been born blind from birth. So there's this blind beggar outside the temple. Beggars frequently waited outside the temple. Part of your good works was to give money to the poor. And so a lot of people come into worship were trying to, some were sincerely seeking God, some were just completing their God points so they could get into the good place. And part of that is giving money away. And so the beggars usually could get by decently. Now, you have to understand, there's no social system in place. There's no DSS for them to go to. In America, we're the land of abundance and blessing. Now, we're squandering the majority of that, but I think that got covered in the revival pretty good, so I'm not going to get into that. But I've been to other parts of the country, and I've been to other parts of the world, and I've seen people that were disabled, and that were homeless. When I was in Southeast Asia, one of the things we warned about is there's going to be a lot of beggars on the street, and the worst thing we could do would be to give them money. And I'm like, but why? They're like, well, they're not going to keep anything that you give them. If you give them food in a package, you need to open the package so they'll actually get to eat it. Otherwise, it's going to be stolen from them, and someone's going to resell it. And I'm like, and nobody does anything about this. No, because the society views them as being cursed, and someone in their family did something horrible, and that's why they're disabled and they're begging on the street. That's not, 2,000 years ago like we're talking now. That's on trips I've been to in my lifetime within the last, 10, 15 years. And that is still the case in many parts of the world today. Also, blindness is not that common in the United States compared especially to ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, if you somehow managed to live long enough, which you're talking about a time frame when living to 40 was like, you're an old man at that point. You've had a good life if you made it to 40 and you weren't somehow murdered or died of an infection. If you got old enough, if you lived long enough, you were going to go blind. It was just an inevitable thing. As you got older, your vision went out. And there's lots of reasons. You could be born blind because, not to get, overly gross here, but STDs were rampant. So a lot of born blindness was related to either chlamydia or gonorrhea as we know them today. It would get in the child's eyes while being born and thus born blind. Okay, you could get an infection because antibiotics did not exist during this time frame, so you can get an infection. Pink eye left untreated can eventually cause blindness, and since there was no erythromycin back then, you had pink eye, you went blind, and whatever eye you got it in, you probably ended up with it in both eyes. In addition to that, there were sandflies that liked to bite at your face, and they'd get it in your eyes. And also just the harshness of the desert sun. If you had a job or a family that required you frequently being out in the desert, just the desert light eventually just blinded your vision. So you got to think about there's no surgery back then. There's no antibiotics. There's no eyeglasses. I can go to Walmart, and assuming they've stocked stuff, I can get, you know what I'm talking about, I can get a 5-pack of reading glasses for $15. I'm willing to wager quarter to maybe a third of us probably have a leftover erythromycin prescription in our medicine cabinet at home. And I know for a fact me and Lindsay and David and Missy have all had LASIK eye surgery, which is the reason we're not also wearing glasses like many of you tonight. We take so much for granted. But here, this is a very common scene. So his disciples see it and they have a question. They say, Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind? It kind of seems like an odd question. Not, Jesus, are you going to heal that man? Not, Jesus, let's go along. And to their credit, they don't try to throw a few shekels at him to impress Jesus. Because we do stuff to impress each other as well. I've talked about this before. John Cooper, lead singer of Skillet, does an amazing podcast called Cooper Stuff that you should all listen to. But he talks about how perception is reality. And how in this day and age of social media, everything we do is about creating an image, about creating a perception of a perfectly filtered life. And we do that and we present that as reality. And we've gotten to the point, as Pastor Dave talked about with the wokeness, we've gotten to the point now to where we've started to believe our perfectly curated, cropped and filtered Instagram life. And it's almost become reality for us. But they sitting there going, who sinned, this man or his parents? Who's the blame is what they're asking. And sin entered the world in Genesis 3. Prior to that, everything was perfect because God declared it good. And ever since sin, there has been sickness and death. And it has affected us all because it would probably violate HIPAA. I'm not going to ask or show of hands, but I imagine a decent number of us are probably on some kind of long-term maintenance medication. I think I'm on 3 right now myself. Happy to explain all that afterwards. I'll try to keep an open book with you guys, right? And so sin and disease have entered the world. And as a famous saying, I like to say, Father Time is undefeated. Eventually, unless the Lord comes back, and he can come back anytime he wants, unless the Lord comes back, we're all going to pass away from some kind of sickness, disease, or some other kind of a tragedy. And it affects us all, and we're aware of that. And that's ultimately the long-term effect of sin, going back to Genesis 3. But they're asking a very interesting question. And it sums up not only the worldview of the time, but the worldview a lot of people still carry today. If something is wrong with a person, it's a sin issue. Not an indirect one, but a direct one. Illness, yes, is the result of the fall of man. We're all going to die, yes, because we are born as sinners, and there's nothing good that dwells in us. It's by the grace of God we're saved. But there's rarely a direct link, even though some people preach this, to where I stole a pack of gum from CVS and then I woke up with the flu the next morning. And I go, surely the Lord has cursed me for stealing this pack of gum. I know there's at least two of you thought, well, maybe someone with the flu virus touched the gum and the Lord knew he was going to touch the gum and blah, blah. Okay, it's neither here nor there. But in their theology, that's how life worked. If you were disabled, it's not because of the general fallenness of the world, it's because of a sin you committed. Even to this day, when I was working with the Israelis at my last day job before here, and some of them were really decent guys that I'm still friends with, still keep up with today, even though we're in different countries and time zones and all that. But one of my friends, he said, and he was admittedly an atheist, like a lot of the Israelis I met. But me and him were always able to have respectful conversations about faith and theology, which is why we got along. But he said, here's my problem. Like, I'm a good guy. I love my family. I'm faithful to my wife. I'm good to my daughters, and all that's accurate. He's a fantastic guy as far as all that went. He goes, but I go to synagogue, and I say, Rabbi, I have all these problems. I struggle with this, I struggle with that. My job is hard, whatever. And the rabbi looks at me and goes, it's because you don't keep the law. It's because you're a sinner. You need to go and do the works of the law. He goes, and that's their answer for everything. He says, and I don't have time for that. And so that was their viewpoint. If you were disabled, there was some sin you committed in which you became disabled. Or there was some sin your parents committed in which you became disabled. Or if you were born disabled, either your parents sinned and you were born disabled, or you committed a sin in the womb and you were born disabled, or God, with his foreknowledge, saw you were going to commit a terrible sin, so he struck you as disabled in the womb so it would never happen. Kind of like Minority Report with Tom Cruise, but with babies in ancient Israel. So we talk about the fallen nature of man. We talk about the sin of man. One of the things that you learn in seminary is called the total depravity of man. And that says that we aren't all as bad as we possibly could be all the time, but we're all 100% corrupt. There's nothing good of us. Like, we're all covered in mud, and everything we touch just spreads more mud, right? Okay, but they took that and kind of twisted it and had this twisted viewing of the Old Testament. But it's not without understanding. If I passed out another sheet of paper and said, I want you to name 5 events from the Old Testament, the first 5 you think of, well, go right ahead. And most likely the popular events are fall of man, Genesis 3, flood of Noah, 10 Commandments, the 10 plagues, parting of the Red Sea, because you just watched the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston this past weekend like I did. Or maybe Joshua and the walls of Jericho, or David and Goliath. That's kind of the ones the general populace are aware of. There's plenty of others, but those tend to come up the most. And what do they have in common? Every last one of them involves God's judgment on sin. Whether we give voice to it or not, a lot of us think the same things. When that guy hits you up for money in the Walmart parking lot, you're just uncomfortable and you want to move on. Maybe you give them a quarter, maybe you give them a dollar, maybe you take time to pray with them. But in the back of your mind, you're thinking, this is suspect. What about the guy on the side of the road at the stoplight or at the exit? And we're sitting there trying to not look and will the light to turn green a little bit faster. Maybe we hand them $1 and a bottle of water and think we've really accomplished something for the day, right? But we think stuff like, they brought this on themselves. That money is going to go to drugs and alcohol. They're scamming me. Maybe it's all true. Maybe it's not. The truth is we don't know. I've helped plenty of people that were scamming me. Me and David can tell this story I don't know how many times. Being A and being first in the phone book, we get an awful lot of calls. And we started talking to all the other churches, and we realized this one lady, like 8 different churches paid the same power bill for the same month. They made out like a bandit for that particular month. You know, it's probably a couple $1,000s they walked away with for a $200 power bill, right? I've shown up with food at a house that had an AV system that would rival most theaters, or someone with a gun collection that made me think maybe they were from Texas, not Roxborough. But I've helped people that were legitimately in need as well. I've gotten to houses where they had nothing, where they legit had nothing. They had 4 walls and a roof, and they were super grateful for what we had to give them. Some of you remember Brett we met. He's gone on home to be with the Lord, and he certainly had his struggles with addiction, and ultimately the Lord just went ahead and called him home. But on he had a swing where he was doing really good, and he wanted to go on the men's advance, and one of you anonymously sponsored him. So he ended up going 2-3 years in a row because one of you kept anonymously sponsoring him to encourage him in his walk. And one time, maybe about a year and a half before he passed, he showed up to me and said, "Pastor Glenn." And I said, "What's Brett?" He goes, "Someone keeps paying for my men's retreats." And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, I'm real thankful for that." And he hands me the exact dollar amount for all 3 men's retreats. And he says, "You go help somebody else." You got it, Brett. You know? So, we do what we can. But the disciples are looking back at this beggar, and what they're really asking Jesus is this guy legit? Should we really help him? Did he bring this upon himself? Whose sin caused this? Who's to blame? And they want to answer. They're expecting Jesus to go, "Oh, his parents did this," or "he did this." And he gives an answer that I knew at some point when I started John, I was going to have to get to this verse. And I knew at some point when I started John, I'd have to get to this verse, and there's no way I'd cover it in one sermon. So I'm just letting you know, this is going to be continued at least another week. But Jesus gives an unexpected answer. He gives a simple answer, but he also gives a really difficult answer. We say, how do you lose weight? Well, you eat less and you exercise more. Simple in concept, difficult in application. How do I improve my monetary situation? You spend less than you make. Simple in answer, difficult in application. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. This is not saying that the man and his parents were sinless, but that none of them committed a sin that directly led to this man being born blind. And they're thinking, if it's not the man's fault, it's not his parents' fault, whose fault is it? Jesus said, it's no one's fault. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. He tells them, this man was born blind, not because of sin, but for the glory of God. This man was born blind for the glory of God. This man was born blind and suffered his entire life as a curset from his people for the glory of God. This man was born blind, and he and his parents suffered his entire life as a curset from their people for the glory of God. Now let that sink in for a minute, because that's real difficult to process. 2 themes really stood out to me as I was scribbling my mental notes and sketches and whatnot during revival, during our Easter service. And it was 2 things really stood out. First one was suffering. The second one was God's sovereignty. If you put the books of the Old Testament in chronological order, That is, in the order that they were written, not in the order that we read them. The book of Job comes first. For the books, the New Testament, in chronological order. The book of James comes first. What's Job about? A man who endures great suffering. What has Pastor Dave been preaching about in James? How to endure great suffering. When God chooses to pen the first words of both the Old and New Testament, the topic he leads with is suffering. When the mega preachers with the hair and the teeth that cost more than my entire annual salary get up there and say, God wants you to have nice things, I swear, if I ever meet them in person, I'm probably going to punch them in the face. But anyway, personal pet peeve right there. Okay. When God chooses to write, to start his letter to us, he chooses suffering. There are 1,189 chapters across the Old and New Testament. Of those 1,189 chapters, 1,185 of them deal with sin and suffering in some way, shape, form, or fashion. 4 of them do not. Genesis 1 and 2 is the creation story in which God declares everything good. Revelation 21 and 22 shows us when everything once again will be declared good. And Genesis 3 through Revelation 19 deals with suffering. There's no way to avoid it. It is a part of life. And the story of Easter is that, yes, life is hard, and yes, there's going to be suffering for everyone, but I overcame that suffering. Matthew Henry writes, the counsel of God concerning Jesus is this. This man was born blind, that Jesus might show God's glory in curing him, and thereby he might show his affliction, having been sent to God to testify of the light of the world. Thus the fall of man was permitted, and the blindness that followed, that the works of God might be manifest in opening the eyes of the blind. The intentions of God might not always appear to us immediately until a great while after the event, perhaps many years after, perhaps never. But the sentences in the book of Providence are sometimes long, and you must read a great way before you can understand the sense of them. Jesus just drops a tremendous theological bomb on the disciples. A lot of you, it's the response on your faces right now. We like to equate in our mind, as does the majority of the world, good things equal God, bad things equal sin, self, and Satan. And Jesus shows us it's a little more nuanced than that. I'll finish with this. Occasionally I get questions of what's wrong with this eye because it twitches, it closes. It's way open more sometimes than others. And when I was 16, I did not know the Lord till 18. When I was 16, I was changing buses, got off the high school bus at Southern, was getting on the next bus to go home. A guy bigger than me, which doesn't take much to imagine, a guy bigger than me, and keep in mind this is 60 pounds ago, he comes up to me and asks if I'd been having relations with his girlfriend. He didn't use such nice language. And the response he was not looking for was, huh, and I don't remember a whole lot else because I blacked out and I woke up down on the parking lot, all fours, blood streaming out of my face, and I couldn't stop it. Right eye swollen shut completely. Later I would find out I had a blowout fracture like boxers get, and they had to go in there and open up my face and clean out my sinus cavity, and I'm very grateful I still even have vision in this eye. It's a little blurry, but it was worth it. I have a big piece of high-index plastic, kind of like they put on the space shuttle, or at least they put on the space shuttle in the 90s, for an eye socket. I've got a titanium screw right here that Pastor Dave has shown up on an x-ray because we used to go visit him when he was working x-ray, and sometimes we would x-ray my face because we were all bored. And we were like, look, good news, Glenn, you don't have a screw loose. So we checked. But because of that, I became friends with a guy named Nick Perkins. And because of him and his family, I ended up here for the first time. And because of that, I stand here before you to share this message. And this, initially, the trauma happened in 95, 96. And here I am, 2021. And I look at my beautiful wife that I most certainly don't deserve, of 16 years now, I think. I can't keep up. We've been together this entire century, so there's that. And I look at all my kids. All right, so David, when you said anyone with kids or nieces or nephews or random kids came off the street, he was talking to me directly. I have all those at my house. But look at all the blessings I have that start with a tragic moment. Now, we're going to get into this in more detail about the sovereignty of God and the evilness of man. But it shows us, this story shows us that nothing exists outside the sovereign will of God. There is not so much as one rogue molecule that exists outside of God's will. Yes, horrible things happen. Yes, I have no answer for anything at all that happens in Washington or any of like the 20 plus mass shootings we've had just like in the month of March. Those are all terrible, terrible tragedies. They do not exist outside of the sovereign will of God. And everything we go through has a point and it has a purpose. In Isaiah chapter 42, verse 7, talking about the Messiah, it says, he will open blind eyes. And here we have the literal fulfillment of Isaiah 42:7. And you can't open a blind eye unless the eye is blind to begin with. And it goes on further. It says to bring prisoners out of prison, that those who sit in darkness from prison as well. Ultimately, whatever physical thing we go through is of a temporary nature. But God is promising us, through the miracle of Easter, eternal blessings. Because ultimately, even though it wasn't his fault, he took the blame for us. Brother Craig Chambers, you close us in a word of prayer.
Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you, Lord, for all your blessings of life. And sometimes we get through some things that are hard, Lord. We know that you're in complete control and your glory will be achieved. And Lord, just help us to always seek you and your wisdom and your ways, and help us to walk according to your will, and help us apply these truths from your word to our lives, and realizing, Lord, we don't know all, and that we need to just lean upon you and trust you, and just thank you, Lord, for loving me and dying for me. Give us a good day in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Love you guys. Enjoy your week.